Hi everyone, this is Mrs. J, and I'm doing a read aloud of The Boys' War by Jim Murphy. We're on Chapter 8, Prison Bars and the Surgeon's Saw, on page 77. As troops assemble to march into battle, an ambulance crew prepares for its day's work. In order to be efficient fighters, boys in the Civil War had to put their normal fears and worries aside. This does not mean that they all lost their emotions. Far from it, the boys worried about a great deal: where their next meal would come from, the abilities and courage of the officers directly in charge of them, or how to get a good pair of shoes, just to name a few. But there were several specific concerns that were shared by all young soldiers on both sides. One was the fear of being lost among the great crowds in which they marched and fought and died. It is not uncommon for an army of 50 or 100,000 men to look across a battlefield and an equal number of the enemy. This is nothing at all like home, where everybody knew the boys' names and faces. Here, a boy was just another body, no more important than the person next to him. There are many accounts of boys separated from their companies, while either marching or fighting, who spent days and weeks trying to find a familiar face. The biggest fear, however, of being killed, and not of having their bodies identified properly. This was not as odd as a fear as it might seem. After a major engagement, the battlefield would be a confusing, chaotic mess. The ground would be pockmarked with hundreds of craters, the result of the ceaseless cannon and motor fire. Bits and pieces of shattered trees, cannons, and wagons would litter the earth, while the black smoke of burning buildings and fields created a murky and choking haze. Frightened and wounded horses galloped all over the landscape. Injured soldiers screamed for water or medical attention. A few wounded soldiers might be seen stumbling to find help, their shirts and pants saturated with blood, some still clinging to a severed arm. Whilst what seeing such a scene must have felt like was captured by a young Fred Grant, who had accompanied his father, Lieutenant General Ulysses S. Grant, during a siege of Vicksburg. The horrors of a battlefield were brought vividly before me. I joined the detachment with the collecting of the dead for the burial. Sickening at the sights, I made my way with another detachment, which was gathering the wounded, to a log house which had been approved for a hospital. Here the scenes were so terrible that I became faint, and making my way to a tree, sat down, the most woebegone 12-year-old in America. The minute the shooting stopped, the men who had just fought in battle went hunting among the churned up landscape for their comrades, living and dead. Thomas Galway did this after the Battle of Gettysburg. As for us, we had been attending our wounded and had been picking up such our dead as we could recognize. Each regiment selects a suitable place for its dead and puts a headboard on each individual grave. They attended to this chore with as much care as they could muster. They would, after all, want the same attention paid to their remains. But it must have been nearly impossible for the exhausted soldiers. For instance, when Grant's army drove toward Richmond in the spring of 1864, it suffered more than 61,000 casualties. Confederate records have not been preserved, but the South must have had similar losses. The dead, who could not be identified, as well as the enemy dead, were considered to a mass, unmarked grave, as Galloway makes clear. The unrecognized dead are left to the last, to be buried in long trenches. A crowded Union cemetery at City Point, Virginia. Only the graves in the background have markers to identify the dead soldiers and their regiments. The corpses are brought into rows and counted, the Confederate and Federals being separated into two different rows. At the feet of each row of 50 or 100 dead, a trench is dug about 7 or 8 feet wide and about 3 feet deep. There is not time for a normal grave depth. Then the bodies, which are black as ink and bloated from exposure to the sun, are placed in the shallow ditch and quickly covered with dirt. Thousands of soldiers would die alone and be buried without proper religious services and in shallow graves. No one would ever know how they died, and no one would ever be able to visit their place of burial. They would be lost forever. No wonder that Confederate soldier E.D. Patterson, a nameless grave at the base of a tree in Antietam. E.D. Patterson worried more about home than the wounds he suffered. I thought of home far away. I wondered if my fate would ever be known to them. I had a horror of dying alone. I was afraid that none of my regiment would ever find me, and that with the unknown dead who lay scattered around me, I would be buried in one common ground. The thought was terrible. How I longed for the day, just that someone would see me die. To die alone was something every young soldier feared. Yet those who managed to survive battle, but were taken prisoner or wounded, might have preferred the fate to the one that awaited them. For If the aspects of fighting represented a shift in modern warfare, the treatment of prisoners and the sick and wounded was something directly out of the Dark Ages. While anger and embarrassment at being captured may have helped these boys add drama to their accounts, their suffering was real. Colonel Davis calls it the black hole of Calcutta. John Delaney said of Fort Henry, the prison he was taken to after being captured at Gettysburg. Our settling down consists of spreading our blankets on the filthy floor, and although many of us are wounded severely enough to merit beds, but one or two are given even bunks, and these are glad enough to leave them to their former occupants, the vermin. Supplies of all kinds were lacking, and many boys report having to get their blankets and clothes from bodies of dead men. Food, always a concern to the soldier, was in even shorter supply. Union soldiers voiced the same complaints about their prison conditions. One boy managed to scratch out a fast description of one of his meals. Rations at last. One coarse meal cracker and bits of small bacon. One ration. We are informed that these rations were issued in advance for the following 24 hours. Useless to protest. We had but one remaining right, the right to submit. That's the best we can do. We are short of rations for our own troops, said the major. Most of us devour the 24-hour rations in advance at one standing. These wretched conditions were made even worse by the horrid overcrowding. The worst Union prison camp was in Elmira, New York, and contained 9,600 prisoners inside a 4-acre enclosure. The southern prison at Andersonville, Georgia, is considered the most fiendish. It was a 16-acre stockade camp designed to hold 10,000 prisoners, but by August of 1864, more than 33,000 had been crammed within its walls without any shelter from the hot summer sun. Elmira Prison Camp in 1864, after tents were replaced by permanent structures. A view of the crowded Andersonville stockade in Georgia. A Confederate boy visited the Andersonville prison and came away with these thoughts. The prison struck me as being, at best, but a miserable makeshift. The day I saw them, they were a sweltering mass of humanity, each unit of which was confined into a space not more than 20 feet. This of itself, the crowding of 32,000 human beings so thickly together, was sufficient to make the prison unsanitary. But that was not all. I saw whole carcasses of slaughtered animals being cut up and made ready for distribution. The refuse which fell into the creek, together with the filth that washed into the hillside during heavy rains, necessarily contaminated the water. I venture to say that on the day I was at Andersonville, fully 1,000 were in the hospital, and that nearly as many more were sick in the stockade. I don't know exactly how many died that day, but in all probability 100 at least, for according to hospital records, the average daily death rate for the month of August 1864 was fully that number. The conditions at Andersonville were so bad that it became a death camp. Of the 45,000 Union soldiers who were imprisoned there, over 13,000 would die of sickness, malnutrition, or exposure. After the war, the commandant of Andersonville, Henry Rise, would be tried and executed for war crimes, the only such trial to result from the Civil War. How did these boys manage to survive the ordeal of imprisonment? No doubt their strong young bodies helped them to endure the heat or cold. Many used their imaginations and skills. After telling about the lack of food and water at his prison, Point Lookout in Maryland, one Southern boy noted, the prisoners carried all kinds of business. Some made finger rings and breast pins out of the Gouda punch, a rubber-like substance made of tree sap, toothpicks and trinkets of different kinds of old bones. I myself was engaged in making crude jewelry, for the proceeds of which I was enabled to purchase many luxuries, such as cornmeal, coffee, sugar, and tobacco. We found ready sale for such stuff, principally among sympathizers from the outside. Many took a more direct approach to getting food, as this Union boy's diary entry makes clear. September 13th, 1863, rats are found to be very good for food, and every night many are captured and slain. So pressing is the want for food that nearly all could have gone into the rat business, either selling these horrid animals or killing them and eating them. There are numbers of drains, and under the houses they are so tame that they can hardly think it worthwhile to get out of the way when we meet them. No doubt most of the prisoner's time was spent searching for food and clean water, or trying to make himself comfortable. Despite these struggles, many tell of evenings filled with the singing of popular songs or religious hymns. Another source of recreation, one boy mentions, is the quiet promenade during the cool hours of the evening. Then you may see prisoners at Belle Plaine line up to get rations from supply wagons. Then you may see hundreds of promenaders passing up and down the prison enclosure in quiet, pleasant, but melancholy converse. Activity in prison was low key and energy saving, but John Delaney did note one intriguing game that seemed to have captured the fancy of many of his fellow prisoners. The prisoners nearly every evening are engaged in a game that they call baseball, which, notwithstanding in the heat, they prosecute with persevering energy. I don't understand the game, as there is a great deal of running and a little apparent gain, but those who play it get very excited over it, and it appears to be fine exercise. While life in prison must have seemed like a living hell to those who were captured, the worst fate was for a wounded and sick. The weapons used in the Civil War had 10 times the killing power of those used in the Revolutionary War. Flesh was ripped and eyes punctured by flying pieces of metal. Cannon shells severed arms and legs with ease. And because of metal helmets were not worn yet, head injuries were very common. Unfortunately, the doctor's ability to treat these wounds or simply to lessen the pain was primitive at best. The science of doctoring was still in its infancy when the Civil War started. Morphine and chloroform were used to ease the pain, and when these ran short, whiskey and bourbon had to do. Iron pokers were heated until they were white hot and then applied directly on wounds to stop the bleeding. And if a wound to an arm or leg seemed too severe to become infected, the usual course of action was to cut off the limb. After one battle, Elijah Stockwell came upon this scene. We moved on to the east side of town and they were fetching the wounded. They were laying them in rows with just enough room to walk between. They had tents for those who were worst off and where they were amputating arms and leg. There was a washout back of one of the tents that had a wagon loaded with arms and legs. The legs had shoes and stockings still on them. Even minor wounds might end up with what we might consider very drastic treatment. While in prison, John Delaney happened to meet a Union Army surgeon. He is a fine looking man and had his hand in a sling, for yesterday, when operating upon a gangrened wound, the knife with which he was operating cut his finger slightly, and fearing infection, he very sensibly had his own finger immediately amputated. Most soldiers looked upon a doctor's work as a useless mutilation heaped on top of injury. And the fact that the large number of the injured would linger in agonizing pain for days only to die did not enhance the reputation of the medical profession. One boy, obviously very angry, some of the wounded at Mary Heights waiting to be transported to the hospital. One boy, obviously very angry, wrote a blunt condemnation of what he was witnessing. I believe the doctors kill more than they cure. Doctors ain't got half sense. Unless absolutely necessary, most soldiers would stay as far away from doctors as possible and treat themselves as best as they could. Teas made from a bark of slippery elm, willow, and dogwood trees were favorite remedies from anything from a cold to infected wounds. Wounds were treated by daily cleaning and the removal of anything foreign. Today, wrote a young soldier with several wounds to his leg and back, Shepherd, who is most kind in his intentions to my wounds, extracts therefrom 4 maggots and cleanses the wounds thoroughly. They, a busy Union Field Hospital at Savage Station, Virginia, 1862. They are doing very well now. I mean my wounds. 1 week later, he writes, Shepherd extracts from my wounds several pieces from my pantaloons that had been carried into my leg by a bullet, which worked themselves back to the surface today, taking 22 days to go the distance of about 2 inches. All of this was done without any sort of painkiller or antiseptic. Surprisingly, the boy recovered from his wounds. While bullets and shells accounted for tens of thousands of injuries, more Civil War soldiers were felled by sickness and disease. The sanitary conditions of the camps and prisons were deplorable. Drinking water and food were often contaminated. In addition, this was the first time these men had lived in such large groups, which facilitated the spread of fever. Dysentery and diarrhea were among the most common diseases, but malaria, pneumonia, bronchitis, and scurvy were also common. Oddly, measles, a disease we consider relatively harmless, turned out to be a major problem for the boys in the Civil War. Once the disease took hold, it could sweep through an entire camp in a matter of days. One gathering of 10,000 new recruits was hit by the measles, and before the week was out, more than 4,000 had contracted the disease. The disease was so common that it became standard procedure to withhold new troops from active duty until they were put through the measles. The treatment for all these diseases was bed rest and plenty of liquids. Even so, one statistician estimates that more than half of all the deaths in the Civil War were caused by fevers. A boy, J.W. Love, may have summed up the situation perfectly in his letter home. T.G. Freeman is dead, and there are several more that is dangerous with the fever. They have been 11 died with a fever and co. A since we left Histon and 2 more died and wounded. So you now see that these big battles is not as bad as the fever.